This is David Marcus with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney was one of 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach then-President Trump over the Capitol riots.
There are some times when you do have to say, partisanship has to be put aside.
Cheney calls herself a strong conservative, but
the only way the Republican Party can go forward in strength is if we reject the lie, if we reject what happened on January 6th, if we reject the efforts that President Trump made, frankly, to steal the election.
The Congresswoman went further, joining Adam Kinzinger, who also voted to impeach, as the only Republicans on the Democrat-led House committee investigating the Capitol riot. And last month, both were censured by the Republican National Committee. Kinzinger has decided not to run for re-election in Illinois. Cheney wants to keep her job, but several Republicans are trying to unseat her in Wyoming, led by Harriet Hageman, who's been endorsed by the former president.
Liz Cheney doesn't live in Wyoming. She hasn't lived in Wyoming. She bought a house here in 2012, but she lives in Northern Virginia with her family.
Hageman started thinking about running in 2020. Then,
but when she participated in what was a sham impeachment without due process, I was really pretty disgusted. And so not only did I start thinking seriously about it, but I started having people all over the state of Wyoming contacting me and saying, would you consider running against her? I kept thinking at some point she was going to back down and kind of recognize the error of her ways. But keep in mind, I'm a water and natural resource attorney. I'm a trial attorney and have been for about 33 years. So the concept of due process is pretty incredibly important to me. And when I watched what was going on with the impeachment, the lack of due process, the lack of information, it was clearly a railroad job. It was clearly done to be expedited so that no one could say, hey, wait a minute, what really did happen here? And I didn't like that.
Now, as you go around the state and you talk to people, you've been in Wyoming for many years. She's not been out there campaigning. She hasn't been around the state as much as you. So you pretty much have the state to yourself at the moment, right?
Yes, which is a rather odd circumstance, isn't it? And it really proves my point that I made earlier, that she doesn't come from Wyoming, she doesn't live in Wyoming, and she doesn't have the Wyoming values. So I've traveled over 14,000 miles by car in Wyoming since September, and I go to town halls, and I have 2- and 3-hour town halls, and I have from the beginning. I've made it to every county, most of them multiple times. I was just at CPAC this past weekend, which was absolutely fabulous. But yes, I'm working very, very hard to get out and meet with the folks in Wyoming. From what I can tell from Liz, the couple of times that she does come into this state, she tends to go to the press. She sits down with them, and I think she uses that as a surrogate with talking with actual people in the state. And then she will go and have a private event at someone's private home with, 4, 5, 6 people. But that's kind of the extent of her campaigning.
Now, she has been, of course, censured by the Republican Party. So what she said was she's not going to convince the crazies, and she said she rejects the crazies, and she says that people against her have abandoned the Constitution. I think she's obviously relating back to what happened with the president and the election fraud claims and all that happened in late 2020 and early 2021. What's your response to that?
Well, a couple of things. I don't think that you ought to call your constituents crazies. And simply because someone disagrees with her or with me, I don't believe that makes them crazy. I think that means that they disagree with me or they disagree with her. We have a legitimate right to disagree with our government and our government officials in this country. That's one of the things that makes us unique. I think that it really demonstrates the arrogance with which she approaches this office, that you're either with her or you're against her. And she doesn't have any interest in convincing you she's right. She's just right. You're wrong. And not only are you wrong, you're crazy. She was censored because she is not doing what we sent her to Washington, D.C. to do. In fact, she's doing exactly the opposite, which is we have a failure of an administration with the Biden, Pelosi, radical left, radical green agenda right now. And I threw in the latter part because we're looking at a disaster in the Ukraine and in Europe right now because of bad energy policies. That's what I talked about at CPAC this past week. And energy security is national security. And one of the very first things that this administration did when it came into office was destroy our energy independence. That is a big deal to me. It's a big deal to me me because I come from Wyoming, one of the top energy producing states in the nation, so our jobs are very dependent on it. It's of great interest to me because I'm an American and I believe in protecting our shores and protecting the stability in this country.
The president pushing a more clean energy agenda. He has climate change initiatives, and he believes that, we need to do more to change our approach to climate change for global warming and all that kind of stuff. What would you do in Congress to try to find a middle ground, if there is a middle ground, on any of that energy issue?
Well, the reality is that our ability to protect our environment and take care of our environment is directly proportional to our prosperity. You destroy our economy, and that's one of the very first things that's going to go by the wayside. You can't come in and destroy your economy and then expect that we're going to be able to spend millions, if not billions, upon those types of things. The other thing is that our energy is clean. We do protect the environment here. We're incredibly environmentally sound. And in fact, to the extent that they're pumping gas or LNG in Russia, it's dirtier than what you have in the United States. So producing these energy supplies in the United States actually protects the environment. It doesn't destroy the environment. You can take a tour of any one of our coal mines in Wyoming and see the reclamation that they've done. You can see the areas that are used by the wildlife. You can see the incredible grass and pasture land that they have created. You look at the same with our oil and gas industry. They can talk about being carbon-free by 2030 or 2035, and they can talk about doing away with the oil and gas industry or the coal industry, and absolutely none of that is feasible.
Now, she said the Biden administration's destroying the economy. Democrats would disagree. There was 7% economic growth last quarter, and for all of last year, GDP growth was almost 6%, the most since 1984. However, inflation is still at a 40-year high as we keep paying more for more things.
You don't just wake up one day and say, oh, my goodness gracious, look at that inflation out there on the yard. It is something that happens because of the policies that they adopted, killing the XL pipeline, the border, the absolute disaster at our southern border. The inflation is real, and it is tied to the policies of this administration. They are affecting real kitchen table issues with people around this country.
All right, you mentioned earlier that there was a sham impeachment for President Trump as he was leaving office. You said that they didn't have the information at the time. Well, now, more than a year later, the investigation does continue. I know she's on the House committee with Democrats probing what happened that day. Why would that be a bad idea to continue to investigate what happened a year ago? We have more than 700 people who face criminal charges. A trial this week is the first one to start. Others have pled guilty. Why would we not want to investigate that day?
I'm not necessarily opposed to the investigation, but when it is completely and totally one-sided, whatever comes out of that investigation is not going to tell us what happened that day. It's going to tell us one version of what happened that day. The reason that they kicked Jim Banks and Jim Jordan off of the committee was they didn't want them to ask the uncomfortable questions. If you're going to do an investigation, the uncomfortable questions are the ones that are the most important in my book. So if you're going to have an investigation, there's a legitimate reason as to why both Democrats and Republicans are appointed by their respective leadership. Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney were not appointed by Kevin McCarthy. They were appointed by Nancy Pelosi. There's nobody on the other side. And you've got to have the other side. You have to have the other story being told. You have to have the other evidence coming in. That's what they're excluding.
Okay.
So
all right. What about the former president? Do you have concerns about what he did that day? He went and he addressed a rally right before the people went into the Capitol. We can't accept the election was stolen from us. I mean, do you have any concerns about how he handled that day?
You know, I was not there. I wasn't there for that. I didn't see it, and to be honest with you, I haven't even seen much by way of video. I'd like to see the 14,000 hours of videotape that the Capitol Police and the municipal police have. I'd love to see all of that. I'd love to see what happened there. Do I think that Donald Trump uses interesting rhetoric? Sure, but we all know the way that Donald Trump speaks, and one of the things that Donald Trump made very clear that day is go up there and peaceably assemble. Anybody who, I have said over and over again, anyone who trespassed or destroyed property that day should be prosecuted pursuant to the laws. And as you mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, they are. They are being prosecuted. That apparently is not good enough for this January 6th committee because they have a different agenda.
Harriet Hageman got to see former President Trump at CPAC. He told the conservative gathering Vladimir Putin would never have invaded Ukraine on his watch.
He understood me, and he understood that I didn't play games. This would not have happened.
Democrats criticized him for calling the Russian leader smart.
Of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb.
The former president easily won a poll at CPAC for who they want as the Republican nominee in 2024. Now, back in 2016, Harriet Hageman was not a Trump supporter. She backed Ted Cruz then, one of his convention delegates.
I mean, I'm from Wyoming. Ted Cruz is from Texas, another oil-producing state, western state. I thought that he would truly understand our issues. And I had some skepticism as to whether a guy from New York City would. What did he do? He did what he said he was going to do. That's the thing. People keep bringing this back. Well, you didn't support him in 2016. He walked into office and he did what he said he was going to do. He made us energy independent. He did close the border.
His support, what does it mean to you?
Well, his support as well as others, it means a ton. First of all, I met with him. He had an opportunity to discuss with me these various policy issues that are important to both of us. So one of the things that it did is it helped narrow this field down so that this is going to be a head-to-head battle between Liz Cheney and I. And while the Democrats in Wyoming have made clear that they are going to vote for Liz Cheney, there are not enough of them to put her back in office if this is a head-to-head between us. So that's important. Also, the ability to raise money, having his endorsement, having his vote of confidence. Some of the other endorsements are important as well, in part for the same reason, but also in part because there's such huge no-confidence votes against Liz Cheney. You know, as a congresswoman, you recognize you're one of 435 people. And if you can't work with your colleagues, you can't accomplish anything. And that's where she is. She can't work with her colleagues. She has a very small subset of friends, about 9 of them. The other folks who voted for impeachment, and Nancy Pelosi and those folks situationally. But she's really burned every bridge she has back in Washington, D.C. So she cannot work on the issues that are important to us.
Harriet Hageman, Republican candidate for Congress in the state of Wyoming, we thank you very much for your time today.
Dave, thank you for having me.